I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. Today's film is Curfew from 1989, and it's one of those films that I remember seeing the poster for quite a lot but never got round to watching it until now. So this is probably the best time to take a moment of appreciation for the poster, because it's probably the best thing about the movie. The film follows a pair of death row escapees, two brothers, the Perkins brothers, on a spree kill trail, seemingly, and also at the same time a young girl who's just entered high school and is sort of testing her boundaries. Clearly from the off, these two plots are set to crash together, but it takes a while for us to be told why these stories are going to meet, and that does rob the first half of the movie of any sense of sort of tension or urgency. It just seems to be a bunch of stuff, one happening after the other. So at first I thought, okay, this is going to be quite a nihilistic movie about random acts of violence, and bad things can happen to good people if you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But at about the halfway mark, the film shows its hand, and you realise that there's a slightly grander design at play here, and I think it maybe might have benefited the film to reveal that a little earlier, because at first what we seem to be witnessing is the Perkins brothers on a random killing spree, when in fact their targets are anything but random. What they're doing is targeting people who were responsible for them being tried and convicted in the first place. And we find out that Stephanie, the young girl's father, was the district attorney who prosecuted the case. So while we're watching these random kill scenes being inserted, we keep jumping back to Stephanie, who's going out on a date with the high school quarterback, and strict instructions not to break the 10 p.m. curfew of the movie's title. Stephanie is played by Kyle Richards, who was the young Lindsay Wallace being babysat by Laurie Strode in John Carpenter's Halloween. Hers is absolutely the best performance in amongst a poor bunch. There are some extremely bad acting performances in this film. The actors playing the Perkins brothers kind of get into the swing of things, seem to get a handle on their characters in the second half of the film, which I don't think is a coincidence. It's in the second half of the film that they actually get to do more beyond just being a couple of quirky, verbose, chatty killers. So it's once they get to Lindsay's house that the film moves from a sort of spree kill into a home invasion scenario, and that's kind of where Curfew finds its groove. An awful lot of the actors find their comfort zones. I think the director finds his comfort zone. It's not a well-directed movie, but what curfew giveth, curfew taketh away, because that portion of the movie means we also spend more time with Stephanie's parents, and you'll be pulling your hair out at the roots with the sheer ineptitude of those performances. I think Curfew wants to be like Last House on the Left, but doesn't have any point to make beyond aping that much more effective and affecting film. At least Last House on the Left sort of had something to say. It had a subtext, it had a meat to it. How could it not, being a creation of the late great Wes Craven? And I'll be honest, even with something to say, even a subtext, which long-term viewers know I love in horror movies, I'm not the greatest fan of Last House on the Left. It's a nasty, dingy piece of work. I'm not a real fan of movies that have rape in them, and Curfew, Last House did, but at least that was sort of uncompromisingly there for a reason. Curfew does too. A couple of alluded to rape scenes, and I don't know whether to be I guess I'm glad that it didn't go full bore for it and show any of that, and sort of pulled back and alluded to it. But that's Curfew all the way through. It sort of has aspirations to be like Last House on the Left, but doesn't have the courage of its convictions to be a full-on exploitation movie. The kills aren't grand. There's not much explicit gore. I guess it sort of adds to this sort of sense of random, senseless violence, but there's sort of nothing there that you can really dig your fingers into and say, yes, this is what Curfew is about. This is why Curfew exists. Now, the first half of the movie is so poor on a narrative level. As I said earlier, it's just a thing happens, then another thing happens, then another thing happens. And I was desperately trying to find something to latch onto. In a weird kind of way, the first half of the movie does play out like an urban legend. It's almost as if the poor quality directing and the poor quality acting give it the feel of a story told by someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows someone that this happened to. You know, you get the girl who's got the date with a quarterback, and she goes out on the date and she breaks her curfew, and he tries to offer her booze, and then he pressures her into sex, and look what happens. I am glad I persevered with it through to the second half of the movie, when the Perkins brothers get to Stephanie's house, and they have a grander plan for that family beyond the sort of wham bam killings we've seen up until now. They want to put them through a night of torment and give them some slight sense of what life on death row has been like for them. And once the movie gets into that kind of a groove, despite all of its obvious flaws, it started to slightly win me over. It at least found its own rhythm. That is undoubtedly helped by the fact that the script does on a number of occasions do some very unexpected things within the genre conventions. Not least, we get quite quickly towards what would be the end point of a standard slasher movie, with Stephanie running away from the killers, discovering bodies relatively early on. And she does everything right. She runs whenever she gets the opportunity to run. She gets help whenever she gets the opportunity. She flags down a car once that car is sort of stopped and the driver of that car is attacked. She doesn't hang about screaming. She gets into the driver's seat and she's off again. She goes to the police. And still, even with all of these smart moves, the horrible things happen to her. And I guess it's just good to see a female protagonist of one of these types of movies not making stupid decisions for the sake of these things need to happen, making all the right decisions and still things happen. If I were to really push myself to try and find some subtext to Curfew, I guess what you would focus on is the character of Stephanie, and the fact that you've got this young female protagonist who is on the cusp of womanhood. You know, she leaves the house to go on her date dressed in a set of clothes that would be acceptable to her father, and then she gets changed out of sight into, and the film does make a point of one of the neighbours sort of commenting on how unacceptable her clothes that she chooses to go out on the date are. But at the same time, when she gets home from the date, we see that she goes to the refrigerator and gets herself milk and cookies to go to bed with, and we see that she's still got her collection of Cabbage Patch dolls in her bedroom. So she's in this liminal space between childhood and adulthood. And it's fair to say that there are a lot of forces in the movie that are trying to control her body, control her sexuality. The curfew imposed by her parents, specifically her father, because as they're leaving for the evening, the mum makes it clear to the babysitter, she's still getting a babysitter, that I don't mind if you flout the dad's rules. The women are sort of more knowing, but it's the dad that's still imposing this curfew, trying to control her. The quarterback certainly tries to control her. He's a real piece of fucking work in this movie, I'll tell you. Definitely tries to pressure her into sex and believes that when she rejects him, that she owes him, because no one has ever turned me down. I'm going to go and I'm going to get what I'm owed. The Perkins brothers, as mentioned before, they're murderers and rapists. So there you have, like, you're running the full gamut, essentially. So with all these aspects trying to control her burgeoning sexuality, it's only when she uses her sexuality in the way that she wants to, even despite her mother telling her not to, that she can manage to turn things around and start maybe getting the upper hand and getting some sort of agency in the situation. It makes me think of a sort of the way that Angela Carter reinterpreted Red Riding Hood in her A Wonderful Company of Wolves story, and the film adaptation Neil Jordan's Company of Wolves. Now, A Company of Wolves is a much, much better film than Curfew, but at least Curfew is dabbling in some of the similar areas. There's also, and this is a real stretch to try and find something positive to say about Curfew, please understand, there's a sense in the Perkins brothers, I kept thinking of Quentin Tarantino all the way through watching this, not because in any way, shape or form this feels like a Tarantino movie, but it feels like one of the kind of grindhouse, sort of grimy VHS movies that Tarantino would perhaps lean on as inspiration for some of his movies. I kept thinking about the Gecko brothers in From Dusk Till Dawn whilst I was watching the Perkins brothers, and no doubt the Gecko brothers are much better written, much better realised characters, much better acted, but you can kind of see seeds of the Gecko brothers in the Perkins brothers. And Curfew does have a real down at heel grindhousey feel to it, not least because, as I keep having to say, it is pretty poorly made. But I think perhaps my experience in warming to it was helped by the fact that I was watching it on one of those grungy flipper disc DVDs and the picture quality was awful. It's one of those poorly made, low rent, low budget, sort of grimy, grungy films that lends itself to being watched on a poor quality DVD or even better on a VHS. And I imagine a pristine Blu-ray transfer of Curfew won't do the movie any favours at all.